If you're looking to build the best gaming PC for $750 that can play all of the latest AAA titles with ease at 1080p, you've come to the right place. Because in this video, I'll be walking you through all of the great parts that make a budget build like this possible, showing you guys how to put it together as we go along and taking a look at performance later, so you can be sure this budget build really cuts the mustard. Let's do this. Don't lag, just game with a brand new Asus router. Purchase selected Asus routers or AI mesh systems from Ebuyer before the end of the month and you can claim a 1 or 3 month Ultimate Edition of Xbox Game Pass on the house. With Asus Instant Guard, safe browsing and free AI Protection Pro security included for life on most routers, you can't go wrong. Learn about the full range or take a look at this Rapture GT AX6000 at the links below. As with all of our builds, we're going to start off with a few core components, looking at the likes of our CPU, memory, and of course motherboard first off. We'll be coming back to the GPU case, power supply and storage just a little bit later. As you can see from our CPU and motherboard combo, I've gone for Intel 12th Gen in this build for a few key reasons. The Intel Core i3-12100F is without a shadow of a doubt the best budget CPU you can buy, full stop. With 4 of Intel's latest performance cores, 8 threads, and a max boost clock speed of 4.3 GHz, it ticks the single and multi-threaded boxes nicely, and meets the recommended system spec for some of the biggest AAA titles out right now. I'll be installing it onto this awesome Asus Prime B660M-A D4 motherboard. Now, we've talked a little bit on our website about what all the different Intel chipsets actually mean in reality. The B660 option is cheaper than its Z690 counterpart, but still provides memory overclocking, still allows you of course to run the latest Intel 12th Gen CPUs, and even gives support for features like PCIe 5.0 and Gen 4 NVMe storage. To install the CPU into the motherboard is actually not all that complicated, though the process can be delicate, so be careful. Take out the processor from its plastic packaging and locate the golden triangle just up here in the corner of the processor. If we flip it around, you'll see it's actually located on the bottom left-hand corner. Once you've found this triangle, you need to find a corresponding triangle on your CPU socket. So just here in the bottom left corner of our motherboard socket is that very same triangle. If we lift up the retention arm, we can then unhatch the socket for our CPU and we can drop the processor into place. If in doubt, line those golden triangles back up, as that will make sure your installation goes nice and smoothly. Drop the CPU in and make sure that it's seated correctly around all these little plastic indents on each corner. You can give it a very delicate wiggle, but nothing too hard, before popping the socket cover back down, removing the black plastic protection, oh dear, and then popping the arm into place to make sure the CPU is not likely to go anywhere. Once the processor's in, we can then go ahead and take a look at the cooler. Now, you get this included stock cooler with pretty much all non-overclockable Intel 12th Gen chips. And this might sound a bit controversial, but it's fantastic. And if you're on a budget, you should definitely use it. Now, an aftermarket cooler is all good and well, but it's going to cost you more money. Something we can put into a valuable GPU or memory upgrade that will actually give us some tangible performance upside. Yes, your CPU might run slightly warmer than normal with this stock cooler, but it's not going to thermal throttle or cause any problems. Typically, it will come with its own pre-applied thermal paste, but if you're going for a used CPU or you've used the cooler before, add a drop of your own on to make sure the thermal bond is nice and fresh. You're then able to go ahead and literally place the included stock cooler around the CPU, and each of these plastic push pins should then go through the holes. Push these down, and you'll get this nice satisfying click sound. Repeat this for all corners of your processor's cooler and then add in your stock cooler fan to the grey fan header at the top of the motherboard. Nice and simple. Once the CPU and cooler are complete, we can then go ahead and move on to the RAM. And for this component in the build, the kit you choose, to be honest with you, doesn't actually really matter, as long as it ticks a few key boxes. The first is that it needs to be 3200 MHz or above. Intel CPUs are less concerned with the speed of memory, but a bit more speed will give you a bit more performance, and that never hurts. You also need to make sure you've got 2 DIMMs rather than 4. This gives us future upgrades and still gives us the advantage of more bandwidth that extra DIMMs will provide over a single slot config. And thirdly, you need to make sure you've got 16 gigabytes or above. For this build, 32 gigs is going to be overkill, but 8 will bottleneck. Don't forget how powerful the new 3050 is. Spoiler alert for our GPU a little bit later. You then need to pick up the RAM DIMM itself and locate the notch in the middle using your handy pointy screwdriver. Once you've located this notch, you can then align this notch with the socket on your motherboard and slide it into the DIMM slot. Apply a bit of pressure on either side and you're going to be nice and solid. Pop that RAM into place. A nice reassuring click sound will show you it's installed, and as far as the RAM goes, we're all complete. There is one more component we need to take a look at though before we go ahead and start moving this motherboard assembly into the case. And that is of course our storage. Now, storage for a build like this can be a tricky decision. James, should I get a hard drive or is that too slow? People nowadays tell me that a hard drive can actually become a bottleneck. But equally on the flip side, these new fancy Gen 4 NVMe's are so expensive, I can't afford those. So what exactly is the middle ground? Introducing this, the Samsung SSD 980. Not the 980 Pro, not the 980 Evo, just the bog standard normal 980. It still gives you some fast SSD speeds, but uses the slightly older and cheaper Gen 3 NVMe standard rather than Gen 4. It will still deliver around 6 times more performance than the fastest SATA SSDs, providing still really great storage speeds and fast Windows boot up times. NVMe drives have the unique advantage of being super easy to install as well. Have a look at your M.2 and locate a few key areas. On this side, you've got the gold contact strip, which manages data and power transfer. And on this side, you've got a little indent, which we'll be using to screw the drive into place. Now, for an M.2 installation, your standard lovely Phillips head screwdriver isn't going to cut the mustard. Oh. Nearly hit myself there. Instead, you're going to need one of these. Not necessarily a large multi-bit screwdriver kit, but a screwdriver bit that is much smaller and more capable of unscrewing the smaller screws that we'll be using to install the Gen 4 NVMe drive. Gen 3, there's too many generations. Gen 5's coming soon. What am I going to do then? Now, on this motherboard, you'll actually find we've got a heatsink, or a heat spreader, I should say, below our CPU cooler. And what that's going to do is obviously hide our drive away for aesthetic purposes, though I think the Samsung 980 is quite a dashing looking SSD, don't worry little fella. But it's also going to provide some cooling, which is very important for new Gen 4 drives and even Gen 3 drives like this, as SSDs in this form factor can run just a little bit hot. Pop the M.2 cover back down into place and screw it in. This will also do the job of holding the drive in, making sure that's not going to go anywhere, using that little indent we pointed out a few moments ago. Once the SSD is screwed in, we can then move over onto our case. Now it's actually quite light. This is the Cooler Master TD300 mesh. Now, this case might look familiar. It's almost like someone took the TD500 mesh, one of Cooler Master's best cases actually of the last couple of years, and shrunk it right down. The 300 mesh keeps some of the great features of the 500 mesh, including, you probably guessed from the naming scheme, a mesh front panel, you get the cool polygon design and tempered glass on the side as well. The whole thing just feels really solid. Construction and build quality is top tier, while your I/O is pretty nice, if maybe a little bit dated for 2021, but what more can you expect from what is undoubtedly a more budget-oriented case? If this doesn't quite tickle your fancy, then check out our top cases to buy in 2022 guide, sponsored by Ebuyer, live now in the cards section. With all cases, you need to strip them down nice and easily to get them a bit more easy to access, and then lay it flat on the table for the next stage of the build, which is installing the motherboard. Before we actually go ahead and screw this in, there's one key step you might need to remember, and that's to install the I/O shield. The reason I say might is because some higher end boards have it built in, meaning it just goes straight in with the motherboard. For us today, it's a bit more old fashioned, but that's what you get with a budget build. And would you rather spend $20 on a GPU upgrade or a built-in I/O shield? I think I know which one I would pick, especially as a more budget conscious buyer. Once that's done, we can take our micro ATX motherboard and pop it into our micro ATX case. Because these two are the same size and form factor, all the motherboard standoffs will be in the right place, making this next stage that little bit easier. Screw your motherboard in through the 3 holes at the top, 3 along the middle, and 2 down the bottom to make sure it's not likely to go anywhere. And once that's done, your motherboard is into the case, and we're sort of on the home straight, really, of the build today. What we're able to do next up then is move on to our humble GPU. Now, up until recently, the GPU market's been a mess, but almost overnight, the thing has fixed itself. Now, this has happened for good reason. Manufacturers have been bringing more and more GPUs into the market and providing the sales channels around the world with as much stock as they possibly can. In pretty much all major nations, the 3050 is available basically at MSRP, or if not, within about 20%, and this Asus Dual RTX 3050 is no exception. Check out these prices on Newegg, these prices on Ebuyer. This card is actually available in the US, Canada, and the UK for definite at MSRP. So no one go in the comments and tell me any different. GPUs are available to buy right now, and it's never really, in the last 2 years, been a better time to try and build a system. This card is also really cute. I mean, look how small it looks. The backplate's dead mini, the coolest dead mini, but it gives you the maximum value for money. You do not need to buy a Strix 3050. It made sense when cards were more out of stock, and that was the only option available. But now, a nice double fan cooler like this will work a treat. And I think it's going to look awesome in our build today. It's so nice to be able to build a $700 gaming PC you can actually buy with parts that you actually should buy, that will provide you with an experience where you boot your PC up and you go, wow, it's finally happened. It just feels so good. Like, man, budget builds back in the day for me were like my bloodline. $600, $700, $800. And a couple of years ago, someone just turned the tap off and told me to go home and stop talking about budget systems. But I can finally do it again. You get where this is going. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install the GPU in, push the clip back on your retention slot, make sure both your covers on the rear panel have been removed. In our case, they have, so we're all good. And then we can slide, of course, our graphics card into place. Apply a bit of pressure and it will click nicely in. Remember to fasten it down with a couple of screws to make sure this doesn't happen, and we'll plug up a power connector in just a moment as we round things off with our cables and wiring before checking out detailed performance benchmarks. To handle all of the cables and wiring in this build, I've picked up Cooler Master's MWE 500 watt power supply. It's 80 plus certified, meaning it's 80% efficient or more. We've done an article talking about what these efficiencies mean in the real world over on our website, and has enough power to make sure our whole system is nicely juiced up. It is on the budget end of the spectrum, so don't expect this to work for an RTX 3060 or 70 down the line. It's good for what we're rocking today, but not great for future upgrades. But the last thing you want to do is spend loads of money future-proofing, only to miss out on the best possible parts you can buy right now. We're going to rotate our case around so we can access the power supply area, which is located at the back of the chassis, just around here. Go ahead and slide the unit in like so, and spin the case around so we've got access to the 4 screws at the very rear. Screw these into place, and then we can run power connections to the CPU connector at the top left of the motherboard power cable on the right hand side, and our GPU on, of course, the graphics card. When it comes to cables and wiring, just take it slow, as the wrong connections won't plug into the wrong places, making the whole thing actually fairly simple. As I say, just take your time on this bit. There are 1 or 2 more bits of wiring we do need to complete, and that's for our front panel. You'll find a variety of different cables stemming from your case, and I'm going to show you exactly where to plug these in. You get one called HD audio, and that goes to the bottom left of the motherboard, powering up the headphone and mic jacks on the top of the chassis. You'll also get a pretty fat USB 3 connection. It's keyed and only goes in one way round. The connection has pins on, so be careful when you plug this in. Finally, you've got your JFP1 connections. These are your really small fiddly ones that go to the bottom right hand side of the motherboard and make your power reset switch and all your LEDs work nice and easily. These are the most fiddly, so be careful, take your time, but you'll be all good once they're installed. And with that, we can boot the system up for the first time and take a look at performance. I'll see you in 2 ticks for some detailed benchmarks, but first, it's time for a montage. seen just how good this system looks, it's time to take a look at some performance numbers and make sure it really cuts the mustard. On your screen now is a summary of all the results we gathered from this build, testing primarily at 1080p high settings across the board. I'll be taking a closer look at some select titles though, starting off with COD Vangaurd, working through to Apex Legends, Fortnite and Valorant later on. In Vanguard at 1080p high settings, we achieved 78 frames per second on average, with 72 and 62 for the 90 and 99th percentiles. It was a similarly positive story to report in Forza Horizon 5, where at 1080p high settings, we once again knocked on the door of that 100 frame per second mark. 95 FPS to be precise, with pretty consistent 90 and 99th percentiles. The results got even better in Apex Legends, where this time we did surpass 100 FPS. At 1080p high, we got 102, with 90 and 75 for the 90 and 99th percentile results. Moving on to the likes of Valorant, here at 1080p high, we got some phenomenal frame rates. Admittedly, this is a much easier game to run than some of our other titles today, but with 340 frames per second on average, the results were sure to not disappoint. And the positive results carry on even further into Fortnite, where at 1080p competitive settings, we drew in 197 FPS. It's one thing hitting 100 frames, but hitting 200 is pretty extraordinary, giving us a phenomenal gaming experience on this system. Finally, we're also going to wrap things up by looking at COD Warzone. Here at 1080p high settings, we pulled in 87 frames per second on average, with 80 and 72 for the 90 and 99th percentiles, rounding off an impressive suite of results from this system. That pretty much wraps it up for the benchmarks though. If you enjoyed it, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.